have started connected data capability. I recall. Is that correct? So we've assembled some of our speakers, and I think we probably need to kick it off by asking that very question of how would you recommend that we go about, any of our interested attendees or any organisation should go about building a connected data capability in their organisation? So that's the topic of it, and we should start with that question, I guess. Anybody like to field that?
Is this thing on? Okay, great. How to go about developing a connected data within your organization. I think every organization is a little bit different, so it's going to be hard to be able to give you a good understanding of what's really necessary. In my organization, for example, it was not something that management understood. So they had a difficult time to understand the benefits of linked data and the possibilities to be able to search through and recommend documents and find information. So for me, it was more of a grassroots effort to finding programs or projects that were willing to let me come in and do the analysis, to get the data, to structure it, to put it into a graph database of some type, and to show the visualization. And at the beginning, it was just me going out there taking care of this stuff. Now, since I've been able to showcase how that's worked, more and more folks are coming to reach out and look for us and look for the help. I've been able to increase the team to 5 different folks now. So from my organization, it was more of a grassroots effort, showing the benefits, giving the managers the understanding that this is what it can work. And it didn't hurt that one of our first solutions saved an organization $1 million. That allowed me to actually showcase that, and the managers were starting to come help me save some money also.
Yeah, I guess for me it's about starting small and being very kind of attuned to what your users are interested in. So, at the beginning we were thinking very much in terms of domain-driven design. So thinking about just the domain of programs and how do our audiences describe that, what are the things they're most interested in, and that then determines what things you give URLs to. So in terms of starting up this kind of connected data capability, for me at least, it's being very much attuned to what's interesting to your audience, to your users, starting there, making a prototype, getting something live and in front of people and building from it, rather than trying to come up with the perfect one data structure to rule them all. You'll get there eventually, but not straight away.
I think probably I'd just quickly reiterate what Paul said, really, and just draw on the prototyping term. So it's something that we do a lot of work in, and I guess a lot of the time there's often a choice between do you spend time modelling up front, or do you just get going with some data and accept that you're having to compromise and there will be imperfections. And I guess the beauty of just getting going with a data set and actually building some kind of network is that you can get it very, very quickly in front of business stakeholders. And I think a couple of the speakers touched on this today, that a picture really says 1,000 words, and getting even an imperfect kind of graph visualization in front of people is a very, very powerful driver for your business case in terms of doing the more important stuff later on.
So from our perspective, as a vendor of technology, but also of, let's say, solutions in this space, of course, we should agree that the earlier you have something tangible, so user interface even, just for pilot purposes and so on, this already changes completely the situation inside the organization. I'm not religious about whether it should be semantic or just graph-driven and so on. For me, actually, the value comes more in the combination of, let's say, different things. So on one hand side, being able to represent your data. Actually, domain modeling is usually in the beginning quite a cheap thing. On the instance data level, it becomes more complicated. But on the other hand, being able to reference whatever assets you have. So we have clients in the States which focus on video, for example, but similar techniques of semantic enrichment can be applied there. Others, of course, are more in the text space. And in the end, something not to forget, and we've seen many organizations get distracted at some point and not really finishing the entire cycle that we advise them to follow as a methodology of how to manage this data later, how to also manage the quality of the enrichment and so on. This is a risk that if companies are not solid enough in this path, very quickly they can get distracted and just take completely different technological direction and then later understand that they did not achieve much, which, as we said, is a big challenge for the adoption of such technology in organizations.
So I'll do one very quickly, which is, I think, how do you do any project? And that's find the problem and prove that you can solve the problem, and kind of what you use to solve it is kind of slightly to one side. So it should be a side effect, not necessarily the solution is to do something. So it may be that you're finding a problem and you can build it in using a graph or linked data or something, but it's the problem and fixing and solving the problem that's going to give you success and give you buy-in at the end of the day.
Wow, too much. I would have sounded a lot smarter if I wasn't following him, if that's similar to what I was going to say. What we found has worked for, we do mostly open data, but it's graphed open data, and we've kind of had a good success in going to the very, very high echelons and going to the very, very low echelons of the organisation. So for the high echelons, finding the actual decision makers, the people who people jump when they say so, and finding things that they are frustrated about. Finding something that, say, everyone's told them can't be done and doing it for them will make a very good impression. And I think the director of IT described our service as having done stuff that he couldn't afford to do under using normal technologies. Everyone wanted it, but using our normal approach wouldn't have been possible. And on the other way around, finding people who think they're the bottom of the barrel and helping them make their jobs easier. And what's very important is you replace processes rather than add to them. No one's got time to do extra work, but if you can give them a different way of working, which is no harder, and they get more benefit from, like for us, the waste disposal map on the website now stays up to date because we have open data on the 52 waste pickup points at the University of Southampton. Not the most exciting thing, but the waste manager loves us. And she keeps that up to date because she's using it to solve a problem. And I think, so high and low.
That's great. So throw open to the audience any sort of follow-on questions from that. Any of you guys actually trying to start a connected data capability or are down the journey and fix some of the problems that Borislav mentioned there, or any other kind of sort of perspectives or questions on it? Sure. We have two mics at the front and two mics at the back.
We should put the serum in first, we'll loosen everyone up.
Hi there. So heard quite a sort of few examples today of people who've of situations where you've moved technologies, specifically from I'm sure it's just all the off chance it's happened today, but moving from RDF to Neo4j. And it just occurred to me that not that it's a spectrum of technologies or functionality, but a decision about how you want to connect to sort of external data. So do you want to connect and consume RDF data? Because what was quite apparent was the people who had migrated to Neo4j still wanted to consume the RDF data, but didn't necessarily want to publish and therefore sort of perhaps fully integrate with the linked data paradigm. Is that a sort of fair assessment?
Well, would that be fair to
Probably, I mean,
direct that to Hazy?
it should be one of the organizations who have transitioned from RDF to Neo who probably should answer. I mean, I'm not sure I'm fully understood the question. I mean, are you saying that, when an organization transitioned from an RDF store to Neo, they still want to be able to access the data as RDF? Is that, I mean, when you say that, you mean through Sparkle or what?
So my observation was that the people who had migrated from RDF to Neo4j, for example, still wanted to consume the RDF triple stores, the open linked data stuff like DBpedia or the EBI ontologies, but they wanted to consume the data to do some sort of internal data wrangling, as opposed to someone like the BBC who wants to interoperate and actually integrate with the data and publish it back. So is that a fair sort of appraisal for, specifically to the people who had migrated? Is that the reason why you think that the migration was feasible?
So I can answer that from our point of view, I think it isn't accurate to say that we're not interested in publishing it, but we are publishing it in a different form. So where we consumed a series of ontologies and then built the ontology lookup service, the primary use case for that is to publish information in a consistent way. Now, we actually thought about just loading all those ontologies into a triple store, as well as publishing an API that uses the graph structure. But we sort of went down the checklist of things that we'd need to do that, and the infrastructure that we'd have to support, triple stores and offering Sparkle endpoints over that triple store, and kind of made the decision that actually serving up a simplified view over the data is what our users really wanted in this scenario. Now, all of the data that we consumed is public, so people that are interested can consume the data through the API that we're providing, but also then go away and grab the original ontology, and we do give them the ability through our API service to do that as well. So it isn't necessarily just that we're not interested in publishing it, but that we're trying to offer a slightly different view or a simplified way of querying the data. So it's really about publishing in a different form with a sort of simpler API, I guess. Does that answer your question? Maybe.
I think my observation, we've had a couple of perspectives of from the kind of development. I mean, Chris talked about the sort of top-down sponsorship level decision makers, and they're helping you to build a connected data capability. We have the bottom up where you've got the people actually using it in their day-to-day jobs, becoming advocates and champions of that approach.
Nigel?
Yeah. Okay. And then you've is this on? Hello? Doesn't make any difference, does it? No. Could you hear me, Simon? Anyway. Yeah. So there's also a kind of dichotomy between the sort of domain modelling aspect versus the development aspect. So developers, my sort of observation is a keener on the more graph type approach than the data modelers or the data architects who are more keen on the RDF and the principles of the open data and semantic web. I don't know if that's a fair observation, but that's one I'd also say has come out today when we've heard from developers and architects.
So, so I talked about our migration from an RDF triple store to Neo4j, and that was a very pragmatic decision to do because of problems in the project. The FT does still use triple stores in other places as well. So we certainly, I don't think, have abandoned them. And the other thing about it was that when we looked at the real requirements and the problems we were trying to solve in our particular area, it wasn't mandatory to use an RDF triple store. We didn't really leverage a great deal of inference and things like that. So I think when you start picking apart what it is, the problem that you're trying to solve, then you might find yourself going down one route or another, rather than going, oh well, we will migrate or that kind of thing. It comes back to what you're trying to fix and what's the best solution.
Yeah, just to build on that, really, I think for me, there's kind of separating out between graphs, RDF, and triple stores. I mean, like I was saying about / programs, wasn't using a triple store, but we could still publish RDF. I think for me, the distinction around using Neo4j or using anything like that, the reason that I've come across for the BBC to be using RDF has actually been more about that it's an open standard. and that it means if, basically we don't want to get locked into any vendor specific because we are a public service, and the amount of money we then have to spend to do that would be a problem. So we feel, from our point of view, the business, that it's worth kind of sticking with open standards, but as everyone said, it's different for different use cases. But I think the most important thing for me is it's never going to be a zero-sum game. Some cases it's going to be useful to use, other things, some people it's not. But so yeah, I just wanted to get across the thing about the open standards bit, because I think that often gets missed out as well. It's not just about data modeling; it's about contributing to a standard way of doing things.
But yeah, that's actually a genuine experience we had. We started off using a triple store which was called 4Store, which was written by my old mate Steve, who was from Southampton, and he went on and had it for a business called Garlic. But that got bought by Experian. Experian have no interest in managing a triple store project. That software is fine, but basically not maintained, and so we wanted to move to something more modern. And when we changed it over and got a different triple store, it took a couple of hours tops. It basically worked, and we were quite surprised, because when you change between SQL databases, it doesn't. You can't go from MySQL to Postgres to MS SQL without redoing everything, and this just worked. So that open standards, woo.
So, any questions to follow up on that?
I just covered this also. So, of course, the open standards thing is quite important. So, a lot of investment has been done already in this area. So, it's probably a thing to have in mind. The other aspect which should not be forgotten is, although I did not agree with all the stuff that we heard today, regarding explicit semantics and so on, and the nice attempt for an example, it actually matters where these semantics lay, whether they lay actually as a part of your domain modeling and as your data, pretty much, or it lays in an application or services layer on top. Just because on one hand side we have a contradiction here, so you say, okay, it's a schemaless world, but then actually you should not change your schema because the software consuming this schema will need to change every time. And these are issues that we are seeing at our clients, and this will be actually just offsetting the problem. It's not for big enterprises, it's not just to say that you can solve a specific problem very quickly. So all of these big enterprises that we see and we work with, they have a continuous, let's say, data governance issue, and they have to manage this data, both on the level of domain models, instance data, the metadata, the reference data. All of this is being overlooked, and I believe that at some point, really services which can be provided, at least on the level of master and reference data, as a commodity, as a managed service, so that it is cheaper for FT or the BBC or other organizations to get this from the outside world and not be dependent on, let's say, how good are their internal developers and how they should choose this or that technology, how they should update the data feeds that they incorporate from the outside. This is, let's say, something that we expect to happen in the next 3 years, let's say.
Sorry, I just wanted to echo that as well. So, and from sort of an EBI perspective, I think we've invested a lot of time and effort in publishing like linked open data because we see the value in it, and sort of some of the things that Paul was talking about for the BBC website is totally a holy grail of we want to get there. But the flip side of that coin, as you say, is this kind of idea of sort of developing applications, and sometimes it's easier. A more pragmatic approach is to build something a little bit more lightweight. And we with the ontology lookup service that I talked about, where we're kind of going in the other way from RDF data to to Neo4j with lighter semantics is actually the data. We've got the best of both worlds, right? The data is already available as linked open data, and all we're doing is building an application layer on top of that, effectively.
So I just got another follow-up, and perhaps we're going to wrap it up after there. If anybody's got any further questions, but what sort of skills would you be looking to recommend that a connected data organisation, putting that capability together? Would you start with domain modelers? Would you start with Java developers? Would you start with ontologists? What would you do?
Empathy. But genuinely, you need to start with people who have imagination and can understand and respect other people's problems, frustrations and fears. And I think that's where you're starting from. You're trying to change an organisation, so it's process change. And part of that is you need to know what really is the problem before you start. Do everything opposite to that lecture we thought earlier about the the data visualizations. The actually understanding what would make it better, and that requires, I think, people who actually get the organisation at quite a wide level, and it's not necessarily going to be a consultant.
So I would definitely start with a good connection between the business/product guys and the technical teams. I mean, this connection, if it is missing, and in some enterprises it is literally missing, so this is a big challenge for adoption of any technology. It just gets adopted, but nobody uses it later. So.
And I have to agree, with the first gentleman. In my talk, I talk a little bit about knowledge architecture, where I really believe you have to have somebody, a group, or individuals that understand the multiple concepts that are out there, not only just in the information architecture or the IT development side, but they have to understand how to communicate with the folks that actually have the knowledge, the subject matter experts that understand the knowledge that you have there. So they have to be able to communicate back and forth from the IT standpoint to how they plan on doing the analysis, what type of data science or what kind of algorithms they're going to be utilizing, and how to communicate that back and forth, because ultimately, in order to get buy-in, you have to sell it to the upper management, and you have to draw a lot of pretty pictures a lot of time for those guys to make sure they understand what you're doing. But to do that, you really need to have somebody that can communicate, or a group of individuals that communicate all of those concepts in a way that's understandable and that can sell what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I'm just going to say I agree with everyone else. I suppose that there's a danger that all of this could be interpreted as we're looking for unicorns, which I think is a thing in journalism around, there must be a brilliant journalist and a brilliant coder. But I do agree in terms of the empathy point that, so my background is in studying history. I didn't come to this from a technology point of view. It's very much around, considering that you can have different points of view and people make sense of the world in different ways, and that understanding the world I think is really important, and not always something that you get from having a developer background. And then I think the other thing is, as Dan was saying earlier, that the danger of having your organisation separate the modelers from the development team and things like that. So, modelling is important, shouldn't over-model, but more important is working as a team. Everyone on that team, regardless of discipline, should be thinking about what is the most useful thing, what's the smallest useful thing that's actually going to deliver value to the users. Sometimes that will require modelling, which is great. Sometimes it will require being more pragmatic. But having everyone working together as a team rather than, high up modelers who are coming up with the perfect thing and then passing it down, it just doesn't work. So.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I would say that these days, there's not a single way of representing and using data. So, we live in the world where any application that's a bit complex will use 2 or 3 different ways of storing data. This concept of polyglot persistence. You have to pick the right tool for the right problem. So the shift in the mindset has to be in thinking what we have all in common, which is modeling data as a graph. RDF is also a graph of connected data. And when people realize, that there's value in exploring these connections, in looking for patterns, that's where the change starts, I think. And then the implementation is, you find the right tool for the right problem, and And by the way, what I said before is exactly the opposite. It's moving the semantics from the application to the database, making them explicit, just in case the message didn't come across clear. But yeah, so that's what I think.
Sorry, can I add something? So I've worked on a lot of innovative projects. I've got innovation in my job title, which is nice. But there's one thing I think people really miss, which is put people in the same room. If you've got people who are communicating through their managers and through design documents and things, that's better than not having design documents. But all of these documentation, all of this process is a way to formalise and record, but it doesn't beat having coffee with someone and hearing them rant about things, and the things that they wouldn't have put in the document because they didn't want to be difficult, and all these kind of things. So I think having the different skilled people physically working together is something that's getting rarer and rarer when everyone's home working and on different sites and all could be in another part of the world. And we sent it to the developers, we got it back 6 weeks later, and they turned out they did exactly what we asked, unfortunately. You know, this is a classic problem. So for any innovation, put the programmers with the people who know about the domain experts.
You're good, Joanne. It's all been said. Any final thoughts, anyone?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Just got a quick question. So we're in a position where we've got our sorts of separate products, and we want to start building the connections between them, getting value out of that way. I just wondered what the panel's thoughts were on like the pros and cons of keeping separate databases and having quite, you could say, like a lightweight graph to draw the connections, versus shifting a lot more data into the graph itself and keeping this data sort of centralized that way.
It's a lot. It's a lot easier to manage data in classical databases, in my experience. Trying to manage graph data is much more complicated. Working out which triple belongs to which record and who's got the right statuses and things is not what we do. All of our data begins life, with one exception run by a student society who are showing off. All of our data begins its life as tabular data. It starts off in spreadsheets, it starts off in SQL databases, and we make it into a graph, and the graphs are read-only, and they're effectively a reporting thing. That's not the case. That was for different things for different purposes, but I cringed slightly when you said linking between all your systems, because if you've got 10 systems, that's 90 links. And I was like, and it's more making each of your systems linkable, so if they're merged, they can be treated as one whole, not 90 links between systems.
I mean, this is the question which already shows some depth of the, let's say, enterprise complexity, and that's what I was referring to also earlier. We didn't focus so much on this data integration and consolidation, where we talk about a single enterprise. So the world is so silos, especially inside of organizations that develop over many years. You have literally dozens of individual databases, or let's say silos, data silos inside. There is no universal answer to this, but there are, let's say, some principles. So, for example, transaction data you would never want to put in a graph database. It just doesn't fit. So you would probably summarize or consolidate individual transactions and represent a specific event in a graph database. So it will go more in the direction of really master data, reference data, and metadata being covered by such systems. And then related to whether, even if it is of these types of data, whether this data should be migrated and represented as connected data, it also depends very much. So you heard scenarios in which, for example, the graph database needs to be static, yeah? Or it's enough to be static, or it needs to be updated, let's say, not so often. These are not all the scenarios in the world. So very often, you know, this data needs to be highly dynamic. Sometimes it is the primary source of information. It's not the other databases that it integrates on a meta level. So this is quite a question. It should be extremely pragmatic. None of the extremes I've seen working in all cases. So it's something that is probably a longer conversation that will be nice to have also, or some drinks you mentioned, Nigel.
Yeah, they're out there on ice.
We should have brought them in.
I think I would pick up on that very last point, which is it's a really complicated question you're asking, and personally, before I give you an answer or give you some clues or thoughts, I'd like to understand more about these different things that you're trying to connect together and why you want to connect them together and all that kind of stuff, and maybe leave them in the thing and kind of have some kind of system which pumps them into some graph thing so you can look at them correctly. I don't know. It's a really deep question of how you consolidate those systems, I think.
Yeah, just to, I suppose, build on what Chris was saying. So I think it's most important that you prepare this stuff to be linked rather than going ahead and trying to link it straight away. Because you need to look at what's actually going to be most useful before you get too far down the road.
Actually, that gives me an idea. Building on what Paul said, so actually there's a very good thing, which is just think about what the entities existing in all your databases are, or the critical ones you're thinking about, and how they're identified uniquely. You might have people identified different ways and different things, and be aware that people aren't always people. Sometimes what looks like a person is actually a role in the database. That one's bitten me a lot of times, because they say you can get the same person 3 times because they've got 2 different jobs or something. So, but finding the identifiers in your organisation will really start to help, and trying to encourage the current systems, and especially when you create new systems, to use the identifiers that you're already in play and not create new ones. We have a database of all of the buildings and all the details of all the rooms, and because buildings and estates knew what all the building numbers were, they were happy, and it didn't occur to them that anyone else needed it, because the useful ones are written on the side of buildings. So whenever anyone in the organisation made a database involving buildings, they just typed in the building numbers and guessed if they didn't know, or put in a textual name, because some of the smaller buildings don't have numbers written on them, but they all have one. And so we published a web page that has a list of all the building numbers, and now that doesn't happen. And that was quite a no-brainer, but the people who owned that data and owned that ID scheme, it hadn't occurred to them it had value outside their part of the organisation.
I hope that came some way to answer your question.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thanks very much.
Yeah, I think my point of view is that's a fairly classic problem in large organisations. I think you mentioned of dozens of databases. I've worked in organisations where they've got thousands of databases, and that integration of data problem that entity relationship modelling has tried to solve through data warehouses and common models and canonical models is still there. It's very possible that a graph or RDF type solution could solve that interoperability within enterprises that Borislav mentioned. So I think there's great potential to do that if the technologies get enough traction and get some early adopters to enable that. So if you're an organisation where you're trying it, be really interested to keep in touch with that, because that's a very interesting way to go, because the entity relationship one hasn't exactly succeeded, I'd say, as a shaking head of a fellow data architect over there. So, okay, I think we should get those drinks. You've got one note, so we're still going? Yeah.
Just a kind of next step question, because if those of us that are coming out of a kind of relational world or even NoSQL world looking at warehousing, this is sitting around where this linked data approach would sit. But I think often, from management it comes, oh, well, we want to use, a tool like Tableau or Power BI. That's going to solve our problems because it will just put the data in front of people. But it's kind of explaining to them that there's more involved. I don't know what suggestions they've got as a kind of a pathway forward, just to explain what this is in terms of why it would benefit.
I guess one of my observations, and I guess it was part of the reason why I mentioned a hackathon as an idea this morning, was I'm not sure whether anyone's ever been involved in Datakind, which is an organisation that pairs up data scientists with charities, and you basically get a weekend to deliver some value to a charity. And I went along to one for a weekend, kind of not sure exactly what to expect. And I kind of came away at the end of the weekend just amazed at what was delivered, to be honest. So I've worked in big corporates for the last 14 years. And, I was seeing small teams of 2 or 3 people, cross-functional teams with statisticians, business people working with BI tools, machine learning guys, delivering more than projects that I've seen running for years with budgets going into kind of tens of millions. And I think a key driver of that is a real adoption of kind of agile techniques within the data science space. I think that there's a lot of opportunities around applying those kind of experimentation techniques in the connected data space. And I guess it comes back to that kind of fundamental, point of debate today around, modelling versus getting going with the actual data. So the relative importance of metadata versus real data, I guess, which, I think prototyping has been shown in recent years to be a great way of understanding that problem in more detail.
Yeah, just to build on that, I suppose those two things don't have to be in opposition to each other. So I think, definitely go down the route of prototyping, but always be thinking maybe one step ahead. So you don't want to paint yourself into a corner, but you also don't want to be obsessing over like the future perfect case. What you don't necessarily always want to do is be prototyping that you end up with something you have to throw away. Sometimes that's fine, and you should definitely not feel you have to stick with something if it's going to be better to throw it away. But yeah, prototyping and kind of gradually expanding rather than prototyping and then throwing away anyway. So.
I'm between us and being I think banging on about IDs again, there are some things in graph data that are easy to change, and that's kind of the links. If you want to add a link or an edge, as you call, or remove them, or add a new kind of relationship, that's fine. You don't even have to use the old ones while you transition. You can see. But we built an ontology, we used an ontology of transport. Which we made up because there wasn't one, and one came out a few months later that someone had created for describing public transport, so we added all the triples for that as well. Well, while anyone who's using the existing one, we gave them a year and we published both, because you can. What matters though is if you get your classes, if you get the IDs wrong, if you change your actual objects and you end up having to split one thing in two and things like that, that's going to make a mess. But having two different definitions of truth about the same thing, that's fine.
Just final note on this. Actually, it's not necessarily that it will make a mess. Sometimes it's just a mess. And Milena, that looks at me from Ontotext, she was working quite a lot, some years on an identity resolution framework. So it's actually the concept that sometimes you don't know who is this John Doe or who is this John Smith, especially when you're bringing data from various sources. So you need context, you need observations later in order to decide whether to split a single entity profile into two, which are different guys, let's say, or different organizations, or to merge some because you see that you have been seeing these two guys in different contexts, but in the end you have evidence that it's the same guy. So that's what we mean by actually that, although it sounds like for a guy that has never worked for a really big corporation, although our clients are such, but for us it sounds ridiculous to keep the same mantra, but yes, we say data governance from the beginning until the end is very important, and the management of instance data, of all the curation cycles, feedback loops, everything of these things is key. So it's very easy on a pilot or prototype level to achieve some things. We should be doing it, of course, but we should be thinking actually that there is a bigger goal, and 2 years down the road after investing millions, somebody could see that it's actually not enough in some ways. Just a warning. Yeah?